Hello. Hi everyone. Can you hear me well? If you can reply in the chat if you can hear me well. Great. Thank you, Mosen. Okay. I will leave the camera on, but just in case it interferes, I will switch it off later. So welcome to the webinar on how to design policy relevant research agendas by on think tanks. I'm Leandro Echt. I'm a research associate at on think tanks. Unfortunately, my colleague Andrea Bertel, who was also the trainer of this webinar, wasn't able to join in the end. So she apologizes, but I cover her part. We used to do this together in other spaces too. So just a quick tips. So Eva will be recording the webinar and we'll share it afterwards together with the presentation. At the same time, I will go through different issues related to research agendas, but you are welcome to write in the chat, or also if you want to say something, you can easily enable your microphone and intervene. Just please be aware that other participants are also here, and try to be timely and shortly with your interventions. But there will be a space for questions and answers later. The idea is to finish in 50 minutes to meet the expectations regarding time. So let's start. Let me know if I'm talking too fast, and if you need to, if I should slow down a little bit. Great. So this is an overview of the issues. We'll talk about what is policy relevant research. We'll discuss some key differences between academic and policy research. We'll go through some principles of doing policy relevant research, that is what this type of research needs to consider and what are the main features. And then we'll get into the topic of more specifically about research agendas. Not just doing policy relevant research, but designing and implementing a research agenda, which, of course, from our perspective, involves engagement with other policy stakeholders. Oops, sorry. Okay. Then what is policy relevant research from our perspective? So here are some definitions that shed light on this issue. So here Wolf says research can fail to be policy relevant when too little attention is paid to the why and how of policy change in the real world. So this, oops, I think Diana says that my voice is breaking up a little bit. Is that a problem from everyone? Should I switch off the camera to see if that's better? Let me see. Okay, I will switch off the camera at least for some minutes. Okay, anyway. Okay, so this tells us that research needs to deal with the complexity of public policy. I mean, policy research needs to deal with the complexity of public policy, which of course we all know it's not linear, it's not unidirectional, has a lot of stakeholders trying to influence, and research needs to pay attention to the why a policy is being designed or implemented, for what purposes, and of course the how, the who is involved in the policy, what interests will be affected, what are the mechanisms to ensure that this policy will meet its goals, etc. So it needs to deal with reality. And at the same time, another definition suggests that policy research needs to speak to real problems, but without sacrificing the rigor of science and the research methods. So it needs to address policy problems, policy issues that are problematized by different stakeholders, but at the same time need to rely on the methods, the rigorosity of research. I mean, the evidence needs to be solid, needs to be rigorous, could be contested, but needs to be created based on rigorous methods, being transparent, and etc. A quick note about think tanks, which are one type of organizations that would benefit from having policy relevant research, but not the only one. I mean, this webinar on think tanks tackle think tanks' interests, but of course, we also want to speak to other research organizations and institutions and researchers that have interest in influencing policy. So the idea of think tanks is that its comparative advantage lies in asking policy questions to the reality. I mean, questions that have to do with policy issues. Then go back and put that questions into research questions. That is how they can be tackled from a research perspective. And then once the research has been conducted and you have some findings, try to bring it again to the policy community with policy implications, with policy answers. This is, of course, more an art than a clear process, but it's the idea and reflects the how think tanks act as are like boundary workers between academia and between policy communities. Just some notes. Oops, sorry. Just some notes about the main differences between academic research and policy research. Of course, in reality, this is not so clear cut, and it's just a way that we can come up with a scheme to differentiate them and understand what's the particularities of policy research. What's the role of context? In academic research, we could say that the idea is to come up with generalized knowledge in a way that it's interest and relevant for different contexts. This idea of accumulating knowledge that is has the chance to be generalized. The other hand, policy research is contextualized in itself. It responds to policy issues and problems in a certain space, in a certain moment that are important for a certain group of stakeholders in a certain community. What is relevant for one type of research and for the other? One, the academic research seeks to contribute to the existing body of knowledge, and a big emphasis is put in new questions, in showing new methods, new theories, present new data. But for policy research, what is relevant is to speak to social or policy problems at the time. The issue, the factor of timing is also important. In academic research research processes tend to be longer. The timing is not so critical. I mean, the deadline has to do with when the research are confident enough, what the researchers are confident enough with their findings. But at the same time, regarding policy research, timing is very critical. You need to take advantage of policy windows and policy opportunities, and your research would be more influent if you have it there to share it and to make a case for your recommendations when needed. And sometimes that means that the research process can't wait to be finished. You need to communicate at the right time. Finally, we can say something about who judges quality. When we refer to academic research, we would say that the peer review system is the one that says this is of good quality, this is allowed to be published, and this is a contribution to knowledge. But on the other hand, quality in policy research means, of course, that research processes have been accurate, but at the same time, policymakers and decision makers have a say on the quality, especially from the perspective of the contribution to the solutions that they need. This is more or less kind of some main differences between the two types of research. What is the purpose of policy research? It has many purposes to have, and it depends on the opportunity, the interest of institutions, the characteristics of the context. So one would be advising and influencing policymaker, policy options, also to shed light and alert on a new policy or a public issue, new trends in policy, trends in the world about, let's say, policy, educational policy, extractive industries, whatever, as well as new policy challenges. It also helps bridge the gap between researchers and policymakers, or research and policy, to generate some common understanding of critical issues based on objective and neutral evidence, and at the same time provide evidence that can justify certain policy decisions, that can contest or verify policy assumptions by different policymakers and decision institutions. This is very important from our approach. When we designed this course, which this webinar is trying to present part of it, we came up with some principles of doing policy relevant research, and they are summarized here. One important thing is that policy research needs to be embedded in policy context. We have discussed already the importance of the context. One important aspect or principle is that it needs to be internally and externally validated. I will come back later to this, but it's the idea that it needs to have been validated, discussed both internally with different actors in the organization, but also externally with people that are people and actors that are important in the specific policy community and policy field. As I said, it needs to respond to policy questions. It can be just academic research and where the contribution is to just generate more knowledge and more innovative knowledge. Needs to fit for purpose and timely. It needs to include and incorporate policy perspective. That's why it's important when researchers in think tanks and research organizations have also a political background and are experienced in public sector. This gives the research another lens, more let's say more aligned with real policy making. Policy research needs to be open to change and innovations. It needs to, as it interacts with other policy spaces, with other stakeholders, it needs to be open to new ideas, new questions, new elements to be incorporated in the research process, because, as we said, the idea is to make it relevant for others. And of course, as any enterprise, organizational enterprise needs to be realistic about capacities and resources. That is to say that doing policy relevant research is not only an academic exercise, but also a political. I need to be to incorporate this political lens. I like this slide because the idea is to make you reflect about what type of researcher you are, and also what type of researcher predominate in your organizations, in your institutions. The idea is that policy relevant research is intense in the interaction between users of the research. And you can have a continuum in which, in one extreme, you can identify researchers and scientists that do not have the interest, the skills, the opportunities to interact with other stakeholders and work in more isolated way. But as we move to our right, we see that interaction with other stakeholders increase and is more intensive, and that's where you can identify different type of roles, different type of researchers and role of researchers. You have science arbiters, you have honest brokers, and finally you have this type of organizations and researchers whose approach is very participatory and very care about engaging stakeholders and policy actors. So I'll say a policy research needs to be placed at least the more to the right side of the screen that we can. It needs to incorporate dialogue with the stakeholders. What's the contribution that research can do to policy? Sometimes we tend to think that that policy research is about coming up with a policy brief, with diagnosis of a topic and policy recommendations. And that's let's say the panacea of policy research. It has, of course, a way of being communicated, different to more academic knowledge, etc. But there are many other ways in which policy research can contribute to policy decisions and to the policy space. It's not only about making recommendations. So sometimes it's about explaining a situation which there is some uncertainty or less knowledge. This is important when you deal with what are called weak problems, where knowledge is not so clear, the evidence base is very contested because of the interest it involves values, etc. So sometimes explaining is an important effort in itself. And the research purpose, the research method here has to do with systematizing, with trying to respond to hypotheses. Yeah, that's regarding explanation. Research can also explore problems. You can venture into a new territory and explore an idea you have, and sometimes that's also a good contribution to shed light on policy issues. Sometimes about describing the key characteristics of a problem, of a situation, a phenomenon. Sometimes has to do with gauging, so comparing situations with standards or ideals. Other possibilities of research is to decide or predict choices. And finally, you have more action research in which you generate practical knowledge as you are already involved in supporting a policy process. So it's not always about doing policy recommendations. Before we enter into the ideas of the elements that has to do with having research agendas or policy relevant research agendas, is there any concern, any questions regarding this first set of ideas that has to do with what is policy relevant research, how can it contribute to policy decisions? You can type them in the chat or directly open your microphone and speak. I'm happy to dedicate a couple of minutes to this and then continue. Or if you prefer to wait until the end of the presentation, you can pose your questions then. Great. Okay, if you have questions, you can share it later. So now I'd like to focus on research agendas. One, we have understood what is policy relevant research and its key features. So the idea of having a research agenda has to do mainly with the outcome that you think your work needs to achieve, and then, as Ruth Levin says, putting together the steps. So basically, you are working in a certain context. There are some opportunities, there are some challenges related to a certain policy issues, and you foresee that you have a chance to make a contribution. There is something that no one else is tackling or no one else is understanding completely, and you say, okay, I want to make a contribution in this sense to this specific policy field in which I work. So what you need to decide on the topic, you need to decide on methods and approaches, and you need to have a clear sense of your internal capacities. Of course, this research agenda in big institutions, different is when you work at an individual level, but in institutions, these research agendas and outcomes needs to be aligned with the mission of the organization. So that's important to have in mind when you join and when you are working in a think tank. And of course, when a think tank itself or the research organizations wants to reshape or refresh its research agenda, it's usually the mission works as a reference. Okay, research agendas can work as a guideline or a framework to guide decisions about research efforts, both at the individual and at the organizational levels. It also an element that can help communicate others what you do and what's your value proposition and why they should be interested in working with you. And in institutions, it's important because it's a guidance that can help articulate different projects, different initiatives into common goals. I come back again to this idea of the mission of a certain institute and how different research efforts contribute to that mission. It's not only about producing a document. I mean, we tend to think that the research agenda is a document in itself. It can or it cannot be reflected in a document. Sometimes it's just reflected in a website when you look at the programs. Sometimes it's not reflected anywhere. So that is not convenient from my perspective, especially from the communications perspective. At the same time, they are alive, and as I said, need to be open to change. And it's a live document, and it needs to be constantly open to changes from conversations, from findings, from specific contexts and situations that emerge that will make you evaluate whether or not you need to incorporate a new issue to your agenda, etc. Sorry about the background noise. So these are some elements that help you understand what a research agenda is or should be. As one colleague, also from our think tanks, says, a good research agenda will help a stakeholder recognize your prior successes, your work, the relevance of your research, and showcase your areas of expertise. So in this case, the research agenda has a communication purpose to show others what you do, and it's very important for think tanks to make others understand what their added value, what are the topics, what they can get from working with them. When we talk about personal agendas, we're talking about something different from institutional agendas, but our main point here is that for think tankers and for think tanks, a research agenda has to do with an agenda of change. It needs to consider influence and promoting change and influence decisions at the political level. It's different from research at individual level, when sometimes has more to do with contributing to knowledge. So it will depend a lot of the characteristics of the interest of the researchers themselves. Some steps to design a research agenda. Of course, reality is not so clear-cut, and many of these steps overlap, but one could say that you could start, organizations can start with the discussion of what they want to work on, what are the priorities. This is typically an exercise of one day of strategic planning, team retreatment in other place to discuss what would be the work in the next year, in the current year, or even in 3 or what's the contributions that the institutions need to do or want to do in 3-5 years. Once you have decided on what to work on, you could engage your stakeholders to collect their views, what they think about what you want to to research on, what gaps are there that are also important to approach, what are the trends, what are the, if you're talking to policymakers, what are the more important policy questions and challenges that they have, you know, and see how you can also incorporate or not that into your research agenda. Set agenda, let's say, validate and confirm, and if possible, put it in a sort of space, a document or a website where you can communicate what you were working on. Raise funds for your agenda, for implementing your agendas, not a minor point. When working at think tanks and research organizations, fundraising is a critical function. And sometimes you have an interest, you have a way of achieving things, but you don't have the funds to do the work. So that's an important issue. And when you have a better sense of what you want to do and what you want to achieve and how you will achieve it, raising funds, it's easier that if you just go and ask for money without a plan that underpin your efforts. Well, of course, you conduct your research. Once you come up with certain findings or certain issues that you think are rigorous enough to communicate, you advocate and communicate based on that information, that data. Let's say there is a think tank in Argentina that wanted to understand what were the status of the public management in terms of how many people does this public sector employ, what are the level of the people, where are more civil servants in which areas. That's what they call the GPS of the state. And they conducted an important research, very quantitative, and when they have the data, they communicate broadly, different channels, and those that information, those numbers were very important and impactful, and alert a lot about the challenges, the current challenges of the public sector, and the potential actions to tackle those challenges. So once you communicate it, you can monitor, evaluate, and learn about your work. It's more or less a suggested process, and as I say, this is not so clear cut, and sometimes it overlaps, and of course processes tend to repeat along the years. It is an exercise that you can incorporate and in different moments of your work at the think tank. I make strong emphasis of the importance of engaging other stakeholders. When we talk about think tanks or research organizations, their agenda, I like to say, is a result of a multi-stakeholder negotiation, which includes all these stakeholders that I put there and others that might be particular of certain contexts. And the agenda, if the think tanks want to be influenced, needs to reflect and incorporate all these voices, interests, concerns. That is not to say that the agenda needs to be guided or based only on the interest of external stakeholders. That's not what, of course, I want to say. It's just an issue, a matter of getting consensus of those who will be affected by the recommendation that you say, who you would pretend that they will use the research that you generate. So in this case, think tanks can work as promoters of dialogue in certain topics. Okay. Here I have an example from the educational sector. Imagine that you are working, that you're a researcher working on the educational quality, in educational quality aspects, and you are interested in topics such as teacher careers or educational budgets, and you have some questions that have policy implications. So how has the labor market of teachers evolved in the last decades? To what extent do the mechanism of promotion support the development of long-term careers? That are issues that you would think are important to make to improve education in your context. And this is a concern that you have because you see that the policy context and the policy stakeholders are discussing this in many different ways. So let's say you have a policy context in which the teachers union is promoting a new law for teacher salaries and ranking, and that generates a lot of discussion in society and among education stakeholders. And that's why you say, okay, I think I will explore this question a little bit more and to make a contribution to this contested issue. The same can happen with education budget. There you have an example, but in the context of the centralization processes, you could ask yourself questions and do research on issues that we shed light and underpin efforts of the centralization, in this case in the education sector. And the fifth column that I have has to do with which policy stakeholders need to be involved in this discussion about your before or during your research. It would be good if you can talk to teacher representatives, members of the legislative ministries of education, to understand their concerns regarding this topic, their positions, how they are looking at the problem, what are the gaps, what information that they would welcome, and in that sense, your research would be of more interest and would be in a better position to inform policy discussions. But engaging your stakeholders is not an easy task. It's not just about asking, what do you think about my research, and receiving a direct response. It has to do more with managing expectations, promote an open dialogue, invite people to a table where they can openly share their concerns, their fears, and their interest. The think tank, by doing this invitation, will need to take care of managing these expectations and make sense of all this feedback that your research idea might receive. Levels of engagement are very different and have many different characteristics. So could go from just a consultation. So what do you think about my research? And could be more of an advisor role where you get together, you set a committee of people, of relevant people in the sector, or that had to do with that specific issue that you're studying, and you create an advisory committee. It could be more about exchanging findings, ideas, evidence with other organizations, including the public sector, or could be more a collaborative role when you share the research efforts and the research findings with other institutions. It's important when you do policy with relevant research and you want to validate with other stakeholders to convene not only supporters of your work, but also people that might have other angles and other understandings of the topics. Important, of course, when working at think tanks is to differentiate the engagement for research agenda, for research purposes, from other types of engagement, because the think tanks will need people to fund their work, to fund their research, to contribute in many other ways. So it needs to be clear what do you want from a certain stakeholder at the right time, and not to mix and confuse things. More collaboration does not always means more impact. Yeah, from the very beginning, when engaging stakeholders, you could have in mind a purpose of influencing policy. So you can convene stakeholders thinking about who will then use how we use your research. Now, coming back to the idea of, let's say, if you want to have a document about your research agenda, there is not one single receipt, as I say, and it has different aspects that you can consider. But generally, good practices suggest that a contextual justification for your research effort would help understand why you are doing what you want to do, what you want to do, what are the research priorities that you have if you're organizations, what are the main topics and themes that you will address, what is your conceptual or ideological framework and approach, if you have something like that. So what's the angle that you will use to tackle these issues? This is important, for instance, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals and this idea of leave no one behind. If you heard about that, that reflects an angle, an ideological approach that will be the umbrella for all your efforts, for your research efforts and your actions. And sometimes organizations do have that type of angle and umbrella, and they want to communicate it. What will be your partners to implement what you want to do, and what will be your funding sources? That's also things that you need to consider and incorporate in your research agenda. Some things that you need to consider when drafting a research agenda. First, the funding environment. What's the availability? What are the donors out there? What type of donors are out there, from private donors to international cooperation? To what extent governments are willing and can share research from policy institutions? What is your staff availability and their capacities? If you have in-house capacity, you need to hire. This is a very common model for think tanks, to work with associates that bring in some expertise that your staff doesn't have. You need to consider, when you work in a big institutions that have different programs that tackle different policy issues, to what extent your research agenda proposes collaboration among teams and multidisciplinary approach, or on the other hand, and it has to be with internal politics, to what extent you are promoting competitions among teams, competitions per resources, per visibility. That's important to bear in mind. And of course, multidisciplinary approach is a very interesting for think tanks, especially when we are working with policy issues that are that has many entry points that will benefit from multidisciplinary ideas and solutions. And as I said, you need to consider partnerships. What others have that you don't have, and how that can benefit your work and make it better and more influential. I would like to finish my speech with some key messages, and then we have a couple of minutes for discussions and questions. like in every policy issue, context matters, both at external level and both at internal. What are your internal capacities? What are the concerns of stakeholders? What are the main hot topics in a certain moment? What would be the challenges of your country, of your community in the next years? Those things need to inform your research agenda. This idea of a research agenda for policy research institutions is an agenda of change, and it's not enough to come up with a document with a contribution to knowledge and just leave it there. Think tanks need to influence, to make efforts to influence, to communicate their research in different ways with different stakeholders, with different purposes. So influence is a key aspect of think tanks. Incorporate discussions with the stakeholders, validate your agenda, but at the same time maintain your independence. Involve as many critical stakeholders as possible and make it be a facilitator of a multi-stakeholder negotiation that can be then reflected in your research agenda. And very important, and this is the art of think tanks, navigate politics, that is, take advantage of opportunities and policy windows, but at the same time include the long-term perspective in your research. Don't lose that aspect of your proposals, in your policy recommendations. You can tackle urgent issues, but you'll need to have in mind the future challenges and raise awareness of those future issues. That's all that I wanted to share with you. I know I talked too much. I hope you were able to follow this presentation. I'll share it. I think I will share it with you shortly. But now we have 10 minutes to discuss any questions that you might have. Is any aspect of the webinar that calls your attention more than other, please feel free to jump in, both via the chat or or by enabling your microphone. I welcome any comment. Here is a research, a series of articles from different people that work with think tanks, including myself, about different aspects that I tackle for this presentation. So if you want to know more, that's another channel that you can use. At the same time, on think tank's website is full of resources that has to do with this topic. You have here my details in case you don't want to ask, you don't have something to ask now, but you'd like to ask me later. So please do. I tend to be responsive. So please share your questions via email if you want. But again, feel free to jump in now. We have another some more minutes, but if there are no more questions, we can close here.
Hello, Lindro. I have a question.
Okay. Hello.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
This is Mohsen.
Hey, hello, Mohsen. How are you?
How are you? Fine, thanks. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question about the termination of the research progress. When we can say that's enough for the research, and we have to go for communication and other processes. Being the first one to promote a solution, or the one who is promoting the comprehensive, the comprehensive solution. There is always a trade-off between time and the quality. When we have, and we can say enough to policy and to research, policy research.
Let me know if I will repeat if I understand well, because it was difficult to hear. So there is a trade-off within, like, let's say, the research process and the policy and the demand from the political side. Let's say, or the urgent
Yeah, yeah.
of yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, that's an important question, and of course there is no clear answer to that. I think it depends a lot of the stage of your research. What have you there that you can communicate, and that you are confident that you are making a case based on evidence. Um, Sometimes you just need to accept and be honest that you don't have a specific evidence from your research to answer to a specific an urgent concern to a policymaker. That's, to be honest, it's always important, but you can try to help them with other ways, more another type of advice based on other research. You can put them in contact with other people that are doing similar things. You can bring in experience from other contexts. But I mean, when you think that you feel comfortable as an organization to communicate the findings of your work, you need to be very sure, especially if it has political implications. If there is risk in communicating something that it's not solid enough, that will have impact in media, impact at political level. You better do not communicate until you are sure about what and how you want to communicate it. So to answer your questions, I don't think there is one answer to that. It depends of your research, of the context, the type of research, and the consequences you might expect for communicating at a certain point. I hope that
Yeah,
helps.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your questions. Any other concern, ideas that you want to share, experience from your work? Okay, seems that there are no more questions. I really hope it was useful, of course. This is an introductory webinar. Maybe I should have said at the beginning, but that's the idea to discuss some aspects, in this case related to the research agendas. We can go too deep in one webinar, uh, you know, in 1 hour. But as I say, on Think Tank's website and myself are open for you if you have questions. And hopefully this will help you in your practices. We'll keep you posted about new activities and initiatives related to this topic to support think tanks with research agendas that we'll be doing in the next months or the next year. So thank you very much, and please keep in touch with think tanks and with me. Have a good day, evening, or night, depending on where you are.